Exactly. Thank you. So what my job will be to give you some context why we have created this model law and why it is important. And Stephen will be going deeper on the guidelines. And then later on, we will take your questions and comments. So first, let me give you some context on special economic zones in Africa, and then I will highlight the AU model law on SEZ. So SEZ development is one of the key industrialization strategy for many African countries. The main rationale is to attract investment, to create jobs, and boost manufacturing, export performance, economic diversification, and also to develop regional value chains. I mean, these are the main topics that we have been discussing in the last 2 days as well. And I remember the Honorable Minister from Ghana yesterday, he put it on point that SEZ are really important vehicles that we have to develop further in the next years. SEZ, as all of you know, have direct economic benefits. This is, first of all, they create innovation, but also knowledge and technological spillover, and also workforce development. The idea is that over time, special economic zones should become the source of industrial transformation and ecosystem development. But if we look to Africa, we can also say that most of these SEZ have so far failed, and we have only few examples that have succeeded in Africa. So the question has to be, why did these SEZ not succeed in Africa, while we have seen other regions developing very fast on these premises? Today, okay, this number has been mentioned also several times. Yesterday, we have around 237 SEZ that has been created by law in African countries, and more African countries are also considering to implement new SEZs. And the model law is primarily created for those countries that are embarking on creating new special economic zones in Africa. And I had a very interesting discussions with Christine from South Sudan, which I really appreciate. South Sudan is thinking in creating new special economic zones, but also countries like Niger and others are considering to create SEZs in their country. So, but how do you do this? How do you do this concretely? How do you create SEZs? And one of the failures in the past has been that SEZ were created without putting enough thinking behind it, and that is also one of the main reasons why many have failed so far. If we look at regional distribution and which countries have implemented SEZ or relatively successfully implemented those SEZ, then we can see that Kenya in East Africa, or Ethiopia, Nigeria, Egypt have done so far very well. And I think they will continue to do very well as they move forward. Regional-wise, East Africa is leading. This has also a reason why East Africa is leading, because the concept has been received there a bit earlier. And Nigeria is doing well in West Africa, but mainly based on oil and gas business. So the nature of the SEZ in East Africa is a bit different. It's more manufacturing based, small and medium-sized enterprises based. Based on experience from other countries, especially China, we can say that the manufacturing sector needs to be boosted strongly through SEZ performance. Most of the SEZ laws rely on a set of policy instruments, such as investment incentives and administrative facilitation, to achieve the intended policy objectives. So the main idea of African SEZ has been to create investment incentives, mostly fiscal incentives, to attract investment. And as we have heard yesterday in the presentation from Richard, this aspect will be challenged starting 2024. So that means that idea needs to be rethought, and new ideas needs to be developed. So that means the policy design, the SEZ regime, the law, does play a decisive role what kind of investment you will be attracting into your country. And of course, the country context or the regional context and value chain development will also play a big role how we will see the SEZ development going forward in Africa. And if we stay with this thinking, and if we look to East Asia, especially how the Asian region has been developed based on SEZ division of labor, but also how countries like China have been developing successfully the SEZ model, then you will always discover that the policy-making process has been decisive, has been very important in creating that environment that you require to be successful. And that is probably one of the main reasons why African continents or the African countries are lagging behind, because there was not sufficient planning behind it at the design stage when the policy process has been started. We know that there are some laws, and Stephen will be also talking about these laws later on, but the implementation were way too weak. So you had a law, you had a SEZ law in countries where I looked, but the implementation was definitely non-existent or very weak. And since you have a weak law, you could not create the necessary dynamic that you require to create that transformational nature of SEZ in Africa. So the backward and forward linkage were not existing, and this problem is still existing in Africa. So then if we talk about model law, then having a continent-wide model law might be something important to allow the creation of a successful SEZ regime, SEZ schemes in Africa. In order to create that model law, we looked at 11 countries and their existing laws, SEZ laws, and that is the outcome of this model law. These countries were Cote d'Ivoire, Egypt, Ethiopia, Gabon, Ghana, Nigeria, Rwanda, Senegal, South Africa, Togo, and Niger. So we looked what do these countries have actually already existing currently or non-existing in order to push their ideas of SEZ forward. An AU model law on SEZ supports African countries, especially those at the beginning of their SEZ program, to get clear structure to establish SEZ law and to avoid common mistakes of SEZ development. So that is one of the main ideas why we think model law is important. It provides also a minimum baseline standard which African states can evaluate their readiness to establish SEZ to attract investment. So if we are a new country, now I will take again Christine, South Sudan as example, then it will be highly helpful for you and for your country to look at this model law and to think through if your country is even ready to create SEZ regime. So it's not easy just to demarcate some area in your country and say, oh, I have a SEZ law, but how do you get the investment? How do you get the infrastructure that is needed? Have you chosen the right place even to create your SEZ? So this is also one of the main mistakes I think we see in African countries, that they identify regions, identify places that are not suitable for SEZ development. And investors will face that problem quite a lot. And we have also some examples from Ethiopia on that. Also, Ethiopia is a very successful example in this case, but we have also those, false decision, if you want to put it, that has, put the country into a difficult place. The model law will also provide a standard outline on governance, development, and operation of SEZs, and helps align SEZ policymaking to overarching industrial development policy within a given country. So it is not helpful to have SEZ policy without considering the overall strategy of the country. So where do you want to go? Which sector would you like to put in place, etc. No? So this law can also help you to put some coherence in your industrial strategy as well. So the model law, now this is just overview, and Stephen will go deeper onto it. It has in total 10 chapters, Chapter 1 will deal with general provisions, scope of application, definition, objective of the law, international obligations. Chapter 2 deals with governance of special economic zones. In this case, how do I build SEZ authority? What are the functions of this authority? What kind of staff do I need for this authority? Funding, how do I fund the authority? Governing body, and then if you go to chapter 3, you will have types and scope of special economic zone. Here, specifically, we look at objective of the zones. What kind of zones are you creating? Is that a technological zone? Is that a textile zone? Is that a manufacturing zone? What are you looking at? Types of special economic zones, sectoral focus. So all these questions will be dealt in chapter 3, and then development is also discussed in requirements for the development, licensing procedure, how do I do this, duties and rights of the developer, duties of the special, the rights and duties of the special development zone developer. And then in chapter 5, we go to the rights and duties of tenants and operators. Sometimes the developer and the operator might not be the same players. So you need to look at that carefully. So how do you manage those two entities? Then incentives. Chapter 6 will deal with incentives, incentive of developers, operators, tenants, or even for domestic suppliers. What kind of incentives are you providing for domestic suppliers? Or are domestic suppliers even considered? I remember in Ethiopia, domestic suppliers were not part of the thinking process at the beginning, but later on, they were discovered to be also important actors. But how do you bring them into the system? And then chapter 7 will deal with administrative sanctions. What kind of sanctions are you applying? What kind of penalties are you applying? Dispute prevention, management, and settlement will be a topic in chapter 8. In chapter 9, which is a very important aspect, and which has been lacking in most of the SEZ laws that we have been looking at, is what do we do with environmental issues? What do we do about the ESG aspect that we have been discussing yesterday as well? And we were asked, eco-industrial park, yes or no. This is okay, it's a good question, but it's not the first question to ask. It's do I have the right framework in place in my laws in order to push that idea forward, yes or no? And the future is definitely going that direction, so countries have to look at ESG measurement as ESG parameters also in their laws and policies. Energy, water, waste, labor rights, but also social, environmental requirements. How do you manage them? How do you require these aspects also from the investors coming into those zones? That needs also applies. In chapter 10, we'll have miscellaneous aspect, regulation, commencement, amendment, and termination. So I know Stephen will go deeper into this aspect, but this is the AU model law that we have been working on, and we made it as simple as possible so that newcomers can use it, and also those who already have some laws can use it to get maybe new understanding or new ideas to implement it into their legislation process that they have already. So with this, I will stop at this point and give the floor to my colleague, Stephen Karingizi. Thank you very much.
This moves forward. Which is forward? This was forward. Thank you very much. So good afternoon to everybody. I know everybody is tired, so I'll try and be as quick as possible. As my colleague has given the clear background on the model law, I'll just highlight a few key issues and a few reasons why this model law is important. First of all, you have a model law. When you have a model law, you also have guidelines to the model law. I don't know how many of you are familiar with public procurement laws of your country. So almost all the public procurement laws of African countries originate from the UN Model Law on Public Procurement, because they never used to exist a single law on public procurement. And the UN worked together, all the countries worked together and developed a model law. To develop a model law, you've got to look at existing laws. So my colleague has already indicated we looked at 11 countries and we tried to have a spread across the whole continent, and also took account of the different legal systems we have on the continent. We have probably 3 different legal systems, what we call the common law, mainly common amongst the former English countries, English-speaking countries, then the civil law, common from continental countries previously associated with continental Europe, and also Roman Dutch law, which is common in Southern Africa. So the model law took account of the best practices in all those laws, and of course we added a few elements that we thought are appropriate. What is the purpose of the model law? Special economic zones are a universal theme, a universal idea. So the model law is an off-the-shelf model that a country that wants to draft new legislation can use as a best practice. But you can also have existing law already and use the model law to amend your existing law. As they say, law is not cast in stone, it can be amended. And it has been tailored to Africa. Every single provision has taken account of what already exists in our laws and taken the best practices. But the third and most important issue we had yesterday in the discussion, SEZs the implementation of SEZs have a close relationship with the obligations that our African countries have under the CFTA, the African Continental Free Trade Area, but also under the WTO, and also some regional obligations, for instance, in West Africa, ECOWAS, in East Africa, East African Community, OCOMESA, in Central Africa, we have CEMAC, so you have those, and Southern Africa, we have SADC. So you cannot just do an SEZ in isolation. You have to take account of what implications will there be in relation to existing obligations a country has under existing trade obligations, because the SEZ will produce goods. How will it enter the market of countries that you associate with? So the model law and further the guidelines which are attached to the model law offer policymakers detailed rationale for each provision of the model law, so that it helps all those that are drafting the law or developing the policy to decide on what options, and also gives you the different options. Open to your policymakers and legislators to incorporate in your law. As my colleague Alex was saying, quite often most countries are challenged with where do we start. This really offers you a highlight of where we start. We also took account of the existing guidelines developed by UNCTAD, but tried to tailor this particular model law and the guidelines to the practicalities that are necessary to adopt the model law in Africa. So the model law is intended to apply to all the types of SEZs on the continent. So for that purpose, you'll see that the definition of SEZ is intended to have a wide coverage. Not just the geographic zone that we talk about, but also the specific legal framework. What does the SEZ apply to? And then we also include all the categories of SEZ. We indicate that they can be 3, a public one, a private one, or a joint one, public-private venture. And as a part of the study, we found that the majority of the SEZs on the continent are private or a mixture with the state. And then we also indicate on important terms, like who regulates the SEZ. In many cases, it may be the minister, but the minister has different terminologies on the continent, and the guideline then directs and provides advice on find out what it should be in your country. And then we highlight the objectives of the SEZ law. What are the objectives? As Alex was indicating, it can be a specific objective, tailored, say, for oil and gas, or industries of oil and gas, and so on and so on. And in your law, then you can highlight what is the specific objective, why you are establishing that law. He has also highlighted the different provisions on governance, establishment, development, and operation. How will the SEZ be managed? Are you going to have a board, a regulatory board? How are you going to establish it? Will it be by this act of parliament, or will it be incorporated in local law? How will it be developed? What are the facets, issues you'll take account when you want to develop it, and how will it operate? Then, as I already indicated, provisions are also made to determine what will be the relationship between the SEZ law and international law. Remember that if a country signs on to international treaty, the treaty, international law obligations have an overreaching power over the domestic law. They are superior to your domestic law, so you have to take account of that. What are your existing obligations under WTO, under the regional economic communities, and under the AFCFTA? Then, in terms of the governance, what are the options for the regulatory body? Are you going to have a government-run body running it, or a non-governmental body running it? If it is a government body, which government departments will sit on the board or authority? Are you going to make sure that you have the relevant bodies on the SEZ board? We had from one contribution yesterday how sometimes the SEZ management is restricted to one government department, which creates problems in terms of linkages, say, with the other government departments. So you can resolve that by having relevant government departments on the governing body, for instance, customs, transport, and all those. Then the types of SEZ that you are targeting, those are provided for in the guideline and the options that you are looking at. The focus areas for the SEZ. What areas do you want to specifically focus on? In terms of not just the types, the guideline and the model law also offers the key focus areas. Is it an agro park? Is it an agro-industry park? Is it, so all those options are looked at in terms of when you're drafting your policy and then the subsequent legislation. So those guidelines can actually also help the state in terms of developing the policy that is then turned into legislation. Then what incentives can be granted? Very detailed guidelines are given on the options for the incentives. And the caution is given in those guidelines as to taking account of the implications, WTO implications, and also AFCTA implications. The negotiations under the AFCTA we had from the minister from Nigeria and also the deputy minister from Ghana, how they advanced. They have advanced so fast in the past 2 years that they are already creating obligations. But we also heard that they have not concluded the issue as to whether SEZ-produced goods will have free access into the CFTA zone. So that is still under discussion. But the guideline then gives you a direction as to what options are there. Then the administrative sanctions, penalties. Quite often this doesn't exist in most legislation. Many of the legislations we saw for the African continent, which we have highlighted, the 11 countries, but we also studied all the others, do not provide for administrative sanctions or penalties for violations of the relevant law. This can be a problem, and probably impede in terms of implementation. So we've given proposals as the kind of sanctions and penalties that can be imposed, and we also give guidance that this depends on the national systems that you have. What institutions exist at national level, and what systems of administrative sanctions and penalties can you impose? Dispute prevention and settlement, this is quite often ignored, and yet it's a very important aspect that is also missing from many of the legislations. We've picked it from some of the existing legislation. In a more modern system, it's better to resolve commercial disputes through what we call alternative dispute resolution. If you do not provide for that, then you end up with commercial disputes going to the courts. And we all know that courts the world over, not just Africa, are slow and more expensive. So a dispute resolution system that is the typical alternative dispute resolution system is recommended. There is also an option for an international arbitration. Quite often you have investors who insist that they will only invest if a dispute arises and they fall back to international arbitration. So the provision is there. It depends on the particular country, the level of development, but you really need high-level advisory experience as to whether you opt for that or not, because quite often it may not be necessary. And then my colleague Alex has also mentioned the ESG issues, environment and social aspects, which previously never existed in many of our legislation, but are absolutely important now to attract some key investors. There was extensive discussion yesterday on the carbon emission issues and how you can have carbon-free zones. So this is addressed because it's now important to attract certain investors, being sure that you have some of these provisions. Finally, there are those important provisions that you have in legislation, like regulations. You cannot exhaust in law everything that you want to do or you can do under the particular law. So we always have provision allowing the minister, in most cases, who has power to supervise that particular law to make regulations, to have additional provisions for addressing issues which will keep coming up and which are necessary for the operations of the law. So that's a highlight of the issues and a touch on what I would consider the topical issues. One issue I have not touched on is the relationship between the regulatory body and the institutions that would be operating in the SEZ, the operators, the tenants. So that is also provided for as highlighted in the summary of the model law, but in the guidelines, we also provide further details on those. So this is a subject that one cannot exhaust in a 10-15-minute debate, but because we have been providing support to the African Union Commission to develop this model law, we are available for any particular country that intends to develop a new model law or that intends to revise its law to conform with what we consider are the best practices we've taken from the existing laws on the continent, and taking account of also the international environment necessary for attracting investments in the special economic zone. So please feel free, you can contact us through the African Union Commission anytime you need our support and services to start going in the direction of developing a law, a new law, or amending your existing law. So this is just a quick presentation of offering guidelines as to the direction which you intend to go. And as Alex has said, we are already processing this model law through the relevant organs of the AUC Commission and the AUC as a block, and we hope it can be used in future for all our states. Thank you very much.
Thank you for both AUC consultants, Mr. Alexander Demisi and Mr. Stefan Karangizi, for this insightful presentation. We would like to wrap up with a small Q&A session, but before I give you the word, I would like to mention that on our online digital platforms web card that has been put at your disposal, the AUC Commission the African Union Commission have put at your disposal the briefing document for the AU Model Law project, if you would like to consult it before contacting the consultants or the AUC directly. So if anyone has any questions or comments, Mr. Greg, anyone else? Okay, I see two people here.
No, thank you. Okay, thank you very much for this very interesting initiative and presentation. I have a quick question. You're also talking about types of SEZs. Now, many countries, they have, under different names, they sort of call it isolated export processing zones, which basically is a single factory, and they can apply for export processing status, and they can get all the benefits, but they will not be part of an industrial cluster. They will not create all those clustering effects by being isolated all by themselves. What is your recommendation on that one? Should countries continue with such status, or should they move more towards the clustering effect of special economic zones, export processing? What's your thinking on that one?
Hello? Okay. You hear me? So I think our understanding is that we are moving, also in Africa, we're moving towards expanded version of SEZ, because that is the right way to go. Those export processing zones, that single factories literally, this has been a relict of the 80s and 90s, and not something that could bring Africa forward on a long-term perspective as well. This has been used literally as a sweatshop, we want to call it, as a sweatshop to attract low level of investment into African countries. But what we are talking now is about how to truly transform Africa towards to becoming a production center for the world. And which I didn't mention in my presentation, but which I will say now is it's a very, very positive moment for many African countries, especially for those countries in East Africa and North Africa, to attract tremendously useful investment from those countries that are now forced to undergo a supply chain adjustment. Those companies that are forced to leave Asia, specifically China, European companies, they are looking for new homes, and those special economic zones in Africa could be such homes if done properly, if done strategically. And I know that Morocco is doing great in this regard to absorb some of those supply chain adjustments, but also countries like Ethiopia and Egypt, they are doing well, but other African countries can also use this opportunity currently. But you need clear regulatory environment, you need clear strategy, and you need also very sharp and agile investment attraction program to do so. So EPZ is something, at least in my opinion, something of the past and not of the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I fully agree. And you can add Mozambique to your list of countries.
Of course. It's also Indian Ocean, so I agree it. Thank you.
There is a lady there. There.
Thank you. I'm Adrian from Mozambique, like Gregor. I found it extremely interesting, your presentation, so thanks a lot. In Mozambique, we're going through a reform process of the laws. We just have a new investment law that comes, and then the next one will be the SEZ law. So my question is, what is your service level from the African Union? Are you also advising countries like Mozambique? Is that part of your of your reach or not? So if we need you, are you here to help?
Yeah, I'm looking at Ron. She's our boss right there. But of course, we are there to help you, and that is one of the main reasons why we are here as well, to share our product, what we have been doing in the last weeks and months, but also to share the knowledge, what we have gained through this process with you, and also to go beyond it. And I'm sure, Ron, you are positive on this idea. So I say yes, we are ready to help you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the insightful presentation, Alex and colleague. My question, maybe two questions, is to say for the model law, I'm happy because, you know, on average, a nation has one SEZ authority. And currently, over the past 2 years, we've had a lot of preachers and the audience is the same because you've got all these different bodies coming up with various insights, the studies, the findings, and then the recipients of this information are exactly the same. So I'm happy to know that the model law is also aligning both from the regional perspective, the AFCTA perspective, and also to say what speaks to Africa. Having said that, can we just quickly, on a high level, distinguish in terms of the model law, how it's looking at the operator and the developer, and to say, if we separate them, how is the model law addressing the conflict of interest or possibility of a conflict of interest in that structure? And then second of all, I just wanted to find out from your opinion to say, in the model law also, how is ownership of land being structured or viewed, or what is the recommendation within an existing SEZ? Thank you so much.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. First of all, I think let's be clear. I think you appreciate that the model law is not binding. Now, what we have provided for, taken from the experiences of the other countries, I think you talked of the operator and is try to provide the options that would be available to a state in terms of defining what they would offer the operator. So there are different structures. So it would depend on the structure that you would have created. So I don't think there is a specific answer to your question, because already you have to decide on the type of SEZ that you are opting for. Are you opting for an independent run SEZ, that's either your operator, or are you intending to have a state-run operator? So then that flows into the rights and obligations that you will offer the different operators. Then your final question was on land. So the model law, I think I said it at the beginning, I should state it very clearly. A model law is not binding. So some of those are also mentioned in passing. What are you going to offer potential investors in the SEZ? And the guideline, that's where the guideline is useful, then points you to saying that it depends on your national law. Do you offer land freely, or do you offer it on a concession basis, depending on the period? So the options are all up to you. And when you look at the different laws, they are so divergent, because also ownership of land in Africa, what we call land tenure systems, are so divergent. You have some states, which we also reviewed, for which all the land belongs to the state. Then you have other states where the land belongs to the people. In other words, private holding on lease basis, while some countries have freehold basis. Leasehold means a lease from the state. So we highlight all those in the guidelines, similar issue to the rights and obligations of the operators and so on, knowing that, and the tenants and so on, knowing that there are different systems on the continent. If your system is this, then you have this option to pick from the menu. But as I indicated, to go into the technicalities means sitting down with an independent observer, and then the state would have to indicate this is existing policy, this can't work in our country, and then go through the model law and pick what would work in your country. So it's an easy off-the-shelf pick with the guidelines to guide you on the different options that exist. I hope that explains what we've tried to do.
Maybe Teresa, just to add something, what we mentioned to look at the local context, that is really the starting point, and that is where this model law will also make sense. That you take the law, it's checklist if you want to put it, and to look at your context, local context. So that's the reason why it matters to know what do you want actually with the SEZ. Are you just creating SEZ for the sake of creating it, or do you have a plan to attract certain type of investment, to attract certain type of manufacturing capability, to create the surrounding supporting mechanisms, schools, etc. So do you have this plan already existing, or are you starting from the scratch? And we had also in mind to look at countries that have not done anything in this regard, who are starting anew on SEZ. For them, this is highly helpful because they are not all over the place and probably also not getting some bad advice or ideas. So for them, that is the guiding framework to look and to think about what they really want. And this thinking process might take a year or longer. You don't know, but at the end, you might have a better product if you use this model law. That is the thinking behind it. So the specifics, I think, Stephen, you did a great job in explaining.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, there is another aspect that we found in some of the laws, which we've tried to address in the model law related to operators. You actually have some of the laws, and we've tried to give guidance in the guideline, where there is, I'm trying to use a non-legal term, a gray area, where there is lack of clarity on what to do if the operator is the type that was granted the license and then violates the license. So we've tried to provide for provisions of what the regulator can do or the state can do in terms of where the conditions that were given for the license have been violated. That is one of the areas that lacks clarity in quite a number of our laws, and which is, from a legal perspective, offers room for conflict between the state and the operator. So there are certain areas like that, nuances which are hidden, which we've tried to address in the model law and also in the guidelines.
Thank you. Right here. My name is Solomon from Kenya. 3 questions. Number one is, in your research that you've done in various, I think you mentioned 11 odd countries, the issue of mixed-use special economic zones. I'd be interested to know what your views are and what your findings were on that. Number 2, the definition of a mixed-use special economic zone from your experience. And number 3, which is the last one, the aspect of disgazettement, or a licensed player, either in a EPZ or SEZ, reaching a point where they no longer want to be a license or a player in that sector. I'll be very interested to hear your views. Thank you.
I mean, I might address your question of the mixed use question. Again, when you, let's say from Kenya as an example, you have now Tatu special economic zones, which is doing quite well in my opinion. So they are doing different. It's a mixed zone. They have real estate, but they have also production facilities. And if you have a strategy for this kind of SEZ, then the model law can also apply because the incentives are there, the arrangement with the operator is there, everything is there. You can use that model law as well to go through that framework that you have created for players like Tattoo City, for example, to give them incentives or to revoke incentives or to whatever you plan to have it through this model law, you can use that. For us, the SEZ is a wider term. So we are not only looking at EPZs, as I just mentioned earlier, but we are looking what makes sense for African countries for the longer term development if they are using SEZ. Now, to remain with Tattoo City, it will become a city at some point, but a city that also produces, that has manufacturing, that has warehouses, that has supermarkets, that has everything. This is now, it's an urban development SEZ, if you want to put it. So how do you manage that kind of development? The model law will give you some ideas to look at. In my opinion, that would, for example, make sense to look at the ESG aspect, what we mentioned earlier, and the model law will give you that idea to look at the ESG aspect within that Tattoo City development model. Just to remain by that. I think I answered that.
Okay. On the de-gazettement, you remember in the presentation I mentioned administrative sanctions and penalties. So that is intended to address that. A lot of the laws we studied lack that. And I also highlighted why it is important. It is important to prevent conflict and ending up in the courts of law, because that's usually the only alternative. And also to protect both sides, because of course the operator or even the tenant of the operator at a disadvantage. I mean, you always, when you have an authority, then of course they're at a disadvantage. But if they are clear about what process, so the model law is recommending a clear, transparent process, but not necessarily difficult, so that they hide under some violations that they are carrying out, sufficiently transparent. And we even propose some periods. Maybe we could have done better in the guidelines to say the periods should depend on the national law system, so that you can resolve any impasse between the authority before you de-gazette. Or if there is obvious violation that has gone too far, allowing for that de-gazetting through those provisions I mentioned. There's a specific provision on administrative sanctions, and then there's a specific provision on administrative penalties, and then of course I mentioned dispute prevention, settlement, and so on. So I hope that explains how the model law has tried to address it.
Thank you. Ron, can you help me with translation? No. Because my question will be in French.
You want to speak?
I'll try to understand.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Okay. C'est une question qui va intéresser beaucoup de pays ici. Vous avez fait un très bon travail et en regardant les lois dans plusieurs pays. Je travaille avec certains pays, vous avez dû voir qu'en Côte d'Ivoire, vous n'avez pas trouvé de loi. Pourtant, ils ont 2 SEZ. Ils ont, bon, si vous voulez l'appeler loi, ils ont un décret qu'ils ont signé. Au Niger, vous avez vu qu'il n'y a pas de loi sur le SEZ. Au Sénégal, il y a une loi de 2017 qui est en cours de révision depuis 2017, qui n'ont pas encore révisé. Et je vais vous dire pourquoi. En Guinée, en septembre, non, c'est le mois dernier. Je vais trop vite? Ok. Le mois dernier, le projet de loi sur le SEZ en Guinée-Conakry, je vois qu'il y a quelqu'un de la Guinée qui était dans la salle tout à l'heure, était sur la table. Ils l'ont retiré parce que ce n'est pas arrivé à maturité. Je vous expliquerai pourquoi. Au Mali, depuis 2019, le projet de loi est entré sur la table. Le Conseil des ministres a été retiré à deux reprises. Je vous expliquerai également pourquoi. Et pourquoi je le dis en français? Parce que tous ces pays ont le même problème. Alors, je salue cette initiative de l'Union africaine. en regardant, ces pays n'ont pas d'abord compris c'est quoi la SEZ. Ceux qui l'ont compris, comme le Sénégal, sont allés un peu trop vite en mettant une loi pour attirer les gens. Je n'expliquerai pas ce qui se passe, mais je sais qu'il y a beaucoup d'améliorations à faire, y compris au niveau du texte. Ils l'ont mis en révision. La première des choses, c'est l'aspect des incitations financières. J'ai vu dans le projet de loi que vous proposez les 10 points. C'est vrai que je ne suis pas encore rentré en détail dedans. J'imagine qu'il y a une partie qui va traiter les questions avec la douane. Aujourd'hui, la douane dans nos pays, que je dis, a un code des douanes qui vient des accords de Kyoto, de plein de choses, etc., qui parfois définit différemment ce que c'est qu'une zone économique spéciale. Comme le code des investissements, par exemple, au Sénégal, en Guinée, je ne me rappelle pas, dit que le code des la zone économique spéciale est une zone défavorisée qui mérite des incitations. Alors qu'ici, ce n'est pas du tout ça. C'est une zone d'opportunité qui doit tirer un pays vers un progrès économique. En partant de là, tout est faux. Ces pays n'ont pas pu convaincre leur ministre de l'économie et des finances qu'une incitation, peut-être je ne suis pas pro-incitation financière seule, mais ils n'ont pas pu convaincre leur ministre des Finances, par exemple, qu'en réduisant certaines taxes, on peut avoir ce progrès économique. Voilà pourquoi, en Guinée, par exemple, le mois dernier, ça a bloqué. Voilà, donc on m'a appelé pour essayer de convaincre. Je suis très mal placé. Donc, je voulais savoir si votre commission, au niveau de l'Union africaine, peut également appuyer ces experts-là qui n'arrivent pas à convaincre leur autorité pour une essai. Vous l'avez sûrement rencontré quand vous avez fait vos études. Est-ce que vous allez jusque-là, au-delà du canevas du projet de texte, qui est très très bien, parce que là aussi il y a beaucoup d'écoles. Est-ce que, ça c'était ma première question, est-ce que vous pouvez, si ce n'est pas le cas, chercher une expertise pour aider ces pays-là à aller vers l'adoption des lois SEZ? La dernière chose, c'est nos amis des douanes. On en a parlé longtemps aujourd'hui. Parfois, c'est les douaniers qui représentent, qui sont les délégués de leur pays dans certains arbitrages, ce qui est très bien. Mais le douanier ne sait que collecter de l'argent et le mettre dans la caisse. Et pour lui, c'est lui qui fait vivre l'économie. Pour lui dire que vous allez baisser un peu les taxes douanières dans une zone économique spéciale, il comprend très difficilement. C'est pour ça que j'aurais suggéré, si ce n'est pas le cas, le projet de loi que nous on avait proposé, c'est de mettre un gros chapitre sur la douane, pour mieux expliquer ces questions-là. Si ce n'est pas le cas, oui, je vais...
No, okay, go ahead, finish.
Okay.
I can follow you still.
Okay. Voilà, donc si ce n'est pas le cas, est-ce que vous pensez que c'est nécessaire d'ajouter dans un chapitre les relations des SEZ et le rôle des douaniers et ne pas les laisser aller seuls dans le code des douanes ou la loi qui gère les douanes? Merci. Juste pour vous permettre de répondre, okay. Il y a mon ami du Niger qui, je pense, qu'il a le même problème, il va compléter, comme ça vous allez pouvoir répondre.
Ok, merci. Je vais toujours aborder en français si ça ne vous gêne pas. Alors, M. Meg, effectivement, vient de toucher un point qui nous tient beaucoup à cœur. Et il l'a dit tout à l'heure, au Niger, nous n'avons pas un cadre juridique. En fait, nous avons élaboré un cadre juridique que nous avons fait initialement sous forme de décret. Et maintenant, quand c'est parti à l'analyse du gouvernement, ça nous a été rejeté pour nous diriger ça sous forme de loi. Ce que nous avons fait. Mais j'avoue, jusqu'à aujourd'hui, nous butons à l'adoption de ce texte justement à raison des incitations fiscales que nous avons incluses dans ce code. Malheureusement, nos amis douaniers sont un peu réticents à ce que les textes donnent des incitations fiscales à des entreprises qui sont amenées à s'installer au niveau de ces zones économiques spéciales. Nous sommes un peu perdus parce que nous sommes dans notre première démarche dans cette activité de zone économique spéciale. Nous n'arrivons pas aujourd'hui à trouver le bon bout pour faire adopter ce texte. En cela, moi, je pense que ce texte de l'Union européenne et de l'Union africaine vient à point nommé. Si maintenant l'Union africaine peut prendre en charge ce texte pour essayer de voir comment l'harmoniser au niveau des différents pays, je pense que notre préoccupation va trouver une solution. Voilà ce que je voulais ajouter par rapport au propos de M. Mega. Merci.
Yeah, merci beaucoup. Thank you. I think I understood mostly what both of you were saying. You see, this is already, we are on one level below now, or below the model law, because the model law is one level up. The model law is up here, and we are discussing now something that is already here. So which I mean, it's internal issue in the countries. That means the customs authority and the SEZ authority need to sit together and discuss this issue. But what the model law might help you now, Niger, and I didn't catch your country, sir, Mali? In Mali, in Niger, is to take that model law and say, look, this represents something of an ideal solution. And within this ideal solution, or ideal suggestion, within this ideal suggestion, this particular problem of the customs issue is something that is really hindering us to move forward. So this can be something as a door opener for your discussions. Because I can imagine in many countries the customs authorities are strong, as you said, because they get the money. So, and who get the money can dictate what will happen. But from the perspective of creating something long-term and something useful, this could be the model law might help you to initiate that discussion with the customs authority. At the end of the day, the model law is a model law. It's a model law, so it's a model. And how you build on that model depends highly on your local context. That's what I also mentioned earlier. If your local context is not appropriate, then this model will not work for you as well. So any model actually will not work for you. And if we look at using SEZ as engine for industrialization, attracting local and foreign investment, then the customs has to contribute, the foreign affairs has to contribute, all players have to contribute. And that is also where the authority, the SEZ authority, whoever is commanding that SEZ law, has huge responsibility to make this happen. So if you have those fiefdoms and small fights, no investor will come. At the end of the day, you want to have the investor to come and to do the job. So, and everyone has to contribute, including the customs guys. So that's what I would say.
Let me add something. In the model law, in terms of the authority that supervises the SEZ, we have made a recommendation I mentioned for certain departments to be on the authority. So one of the departments we recommend is the customs authority. But also on the provision under incentives, and I don't know when people will get a copy of the model law. In the guidelines, we've tried to indicate, when you have a chance, you look at the incentives where we talk of both fiscal and non-fiscal incentives. We have tried to indicate that there is a need for the authority to ensure that they engage the customs authority in terms of creating a harmonious relationship with the tenants and operators. So some of these things are recommended in terms as to how those relationships can be addressed the way my colleague Alex has advised, because these are the actual real life examples, challenges that you get when you actually start implementing the SEZ. So there are some pointers in the guidelines to the model law as to how the state can address some of those issues.
I apologize for having to play the bad cop, but we're going to have to stop the Q&A session. Mr. Ron? Yeah, something to say? Yeah. So we'll finish off on a good note with Ms. Ron's intervention.
Hello, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I know it's very late in the afternoon, and I know that I missed you yesterday, actually. I was not able to be with you. I'm Ron Osman. I represent the Department of Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry and Mineral Development, and it's a great department in the African Union Commission. We are the department actually who created and delivered the ACFTA. The Africa Free Zone, the Africa Continental Free Zone was an idea in the Department of Economic Development, Trade and Industry at that moment, 10 years back. And in less than 10 years, it's now effective. But then we did this, the ACFTA, to boost the intra-Africa trade. But for us to boost the intra-Africa trade, we need to produce. And we think that it's really important for us to do industrialization, to do manufacturing, to do value addition. And for that, we think also that the specific economic, the special economic zones are a tool for producing goods that we will also commercialize and trade among ourselves in the ACFTA. But then how to do this? We asked how my brother Alex was saying, it's now more than 5 years that we are trying to work in the Department of Trade and Industry before and now Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry and Minerals on how we can help the member states, the African member states, the 55 member states, to use this tool to produce more. And as you all know, industrialization is a sovereign decision. It's a national sovereign decision. It's only country that can do whatever they need to do so. But as the department, we are trying to help you. And we, 2 years back, we worked with UNCTAD on what we call the handbook to understand what the SEZ was in Africa. And then the last 2 years, the last year, we were working with this high-value gentlemen that worked on this model law that we hope it will be agreeable for you to use it with the guidelines on how you can adopt and adapt it to your different economy. Just to tell you, in their terms of reference, actually, they have to help Niger to have its own laws, because Niger asked us to support them in the kind of the Summit on Industrialization and Economic Development that we had last week in Niamey, and they will support Niger to establish their industrial park or special economic zones the way they want it to be. But actually, I get the message from Mozambique, and I think that we will work on also the possibility for them to support whoever country, African Union member states, country who will need the support on doing new laws or adapting the laws that they have to use the special economic zones for the economic development of their country. We know that there are some gaps, there are some things but we are really here to support the member states, and we are also here to get your guidance and your instruction. We work for you, we are your secretariat. So the way you ask us to work, that's the way we will help you to deliver the economic development of the continent. And we think that industrialization is a tool for the economic development of the continent, and that special economic zones are a tool for this industrial development and economic development. So I know that it's very late, and I see Balkhis looking at me. I will stop here, and I thank you all very much. And I think that I addressed all the questions. Okay.